Seattle General's Level 1 Trauma Center was known for two things: its state-of-the-art medical technology and the towering, suffocating egos of the surgeons who stalked its pristine hallways. Thomas Vance fit into neither category. At 45, Thomas was the oldest junior nurse on the floor. He kept his head down, his graying hair cropped in a neat, unassuming fade, and his voice perpetually set to a calm, deferential volume. He spent his shifts quietly restocking the trauma bays, organizing IV lines, and absorbing the endless barrage of insults from the hospital's elite staff. He never argued, he never fought back. He simply did his job, floating through the fluorescent-lit corridors like a ghost who had long ago forgotten how to haunt. "Vance, are you deaf or just physically incapable of moving faster than a tranquilized turtle?" The sharp, condescending voice belonged to Dr. Julian Sterling. Sterling was 32, a prodigy trauma surgeon with perfect hair, a trust fund, and a Rolex that cost more than Thomas made in a year. He stood at the center of Trauma Bay 1, flanked by two swooning interns and Brenda, the notoriously cruel head nurse who treated Sterling like royalty and everyone else like dirt. Thomas stopped wiping down the stainless steel prep cable and turned, a damp rag still in his hand. "Sorry, Dr. Sterling, can I help you with something?" Sterling sighed dramatically, pinching the bridge of his nose as if Thomas's very existence was a migraine. "I asked for the pediatric intubation kit 5 minutes ago, Vance. Not that I'd expect a junior nurse who transferred from some no-name rural clinic to understand the urgency of a Level 1 facility, but we do have standards here." "The pediatric kit is already on the secondary cart, Doctor," Thomas said mildly, gesturing toward the perfectly organized tray just inches from Sterling's left elbow. "I restocked it this morning, adjusted the Miller blades, and ensured the endotracheal tubes were sequenced by size for faster access." Sterling glanced down, noticing the flawlessly arranged kit. A flash of irritation crossed his handsome face. He hated being wrong, and he hated it even more when Thomas was the one to point it out. "Nobody asked me to reorganize my trauma bay, Vance," Sterling snapped, stepping closer, his voice dripping with venom. "You are here to fetch, carry, and clean. You are an extra pair of hands, and frankly, barely functioning ones at that. Leave the medical logistics to people who actually went to a real medical school. If you want to play doctor, go buy a plastic stethoscope." The interns giggled nervously. Brenda smirked, crossing her arms. "Honestly, Thomas, if you can't handle the pace, maybe you should look into a nice, quiet nursing home. You certainly move like you belong in one." Thomas looked at Brenda, then back to Sterling. His posture remained relaxed, his expression entirely unreadable. A faint, almost imperceptible white scar trailed just beneath his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his faded blue scrubs. "Understood, Dr. Sterling. It won't happen again," Thomas said evenly. "See that it doesn't," Sterling sneered, turning his back on Thomas. "Now, get out of my bay. Go empty the sharps containers. Try not to hurt yourself." Thomas nodded, picking up his rag and walking out into the bustling hallway. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't grind his teeth. The anger that Sterling so desperately wanted to provoke simply wasn't there. As Thomas pushed his cart down the corridor, his mind briefly drifted. He remembered a time when the pressure was real. Not the manufactured drama of a civilian ER, but the suffocating, dust-choked heat of the Karengal Valley. He remembered the deafening roar of RPG fire, the metallic scent of copper in the air, and the feeling of holding a ruptured femoral artery together with his bare hands while returning fire. Dr. Sterling thought he knew stress. Dr. Sterling thought a delayed intubation kit was a crisis. Thomas actually preferred their arrogance. It meant they didn't know. It meant his cover as a quiet, washed-up civilian nurse was working perfectly. He had spent 2 decades walking through hell, and now all he wanted was the sterile, predictable boredom of Seattle General. But the universe, it seemed, was done letting Thomas rest. The shrill, agonizing wail of the hospital's primary red line phone suddenly shattered the ambient noise of the ER. It wasn't the standard ringtone for incoming civilian ambulances. This was the catastrophic bypass line, the one that only rang for mass casualty events. Dr. Sterling froze, his smug smile vanishing. Brenda dropped her clipboard. Before anyone could answer, the heavy double doors of the ER blew open. A terrified paramedic sprinted into the lobby, breathless and covered in soot. "Clear the bays," the paramedic screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Clear all of them. Multi-vehicle ambush on the I-90 bridge. It's a military transport convoy. We've got Black Hawk escorts, inbound multiple critical high-ranking casualties, and active ordnance." The color drained entirely from Dr. Sterling's face. The entire ER fell into a dead, paralyzed silence. Thomas stopped his cart. His eyes hardened. The quiet, submissive nurse vanished in an instant, replaced by something cold, sharp, and terrifyingly awake.
The rhythmic, thunderous thwack, thwack, thwack of military rotary wings shook the very foundation of Seattle General. The glass of the ER doors violently vibrated in their frames as not one but two UH-60 Blackhawks touched down on the reinforced helipads outside. Inside Trauma Bay 1, the illusion of Dr. Julian Sterling's control vanished. He stood frozen for a microscopic second before his ego frantically overrode his shock. "Brenda, get the mass casualty carts. Interns, prep bays 2 through 6. I want full trauma teams ready now," Sterling barked, his voice an octave higher and much thinner than usual. He spun toward Thomas, who was quietly securing a row of IV fluid bags. "Vance, get in the corner and stay out of the way. Don't touch a damn thing unless I tell you to." Thomas didn't argue. He took a calculated step back, blending into the shadows of the bay, his eyes already scanning the entrance. The air in the hospital shifted. The sterile scent of antiseptic was suddenly overwhelmed by the harsh metallic odors of cordite, burning rubber, and sweat. The double doors burst open. 4 men in heavily scorched tactical gear surged into the ER lobby. They weren't standard infantry. Their kit lacked official insignia, their weapons were heavily customized, and their faces were painted with the grim, desperate urgency of men who had just looked death in the eye. Between them, they carried a tactical stretcher bearing a massive, heavily muscled man. His plate carrier had been blown cleanly off his chest, and his uniform was charred from a concussive blast wave. "We need a trauma surgeon, right now," the lead operator roared, his voice cutting fiercely through the rising panic of the civilian staff. He took the brunt of an IED blast, shrapnel to the upper quadrant, massive blunt force trauma to the chest. Sterling puffed out his chest, desperately trying to project authority as he waved the interns into position. "I am Dr. Sterling, lead trauma surgeon. Get him on the table and step back, soldiers. You're in my house now. Let the real professionals work." The operators hesitated, their eyes darting around the pristine, almost fragile-looking civilian doctors, but they reluctantly transferred their commander to the trauma bed and backed away, their hands hovering near their holsters. "All right, let's see what we've got." Sterling grabbed a pair of shears and aggressively cutting away the remnants of the soldier's shirt. He fixated immediately on a jagged, terrifying-looking piece of metal lodged near the soldier's collarbone. "Deep laceration. Brenda, get me a clamp and lap sponges. We need to control this bleeding immediately." From his corner, Thomas Vance's eyes narrowed. He wasn't looking at the bloody shoulder. His gaze was locked on the soldier's neck. "Jugular vein distension," Thomas noted silently. His eyes dropped to the soldier's battered chest. Asymmetrical rise and fall, tracheal deviation, no breath sounds on the right side. "Heart rate is skyrocketing, Dr. Sterling," an intern panicked, staring wide-eyed at the monitor. 140 and climbing. Blood pressure is tanking, 70/40. "He's bleeding out from the shoulder wound. Push 2 units of O- and get me a portable X-ray stat," Sterling ordered, his hands frantically pressing gauze into the collarbone, completely missing the bigger picture. "Why isn't his pressure stabilizing?" "Doctor," one of the operators stepped forward, his voice tight with restrained panic. "He was thrown into a concrete barrier. He's struggling to breathe." "I said step back," Sterling snapped, losing his composure. "I am trying to save his arm and stop this bleed. Intern, prepare to intubate." Thomas's jaw tightened. The faint scar on his neck seemed to burn. Sterling was treating the distraction. The bleeding in the shoulder was messy, but it wasn't what was killing the man. The blunt force trauma from the blast had caused a massive tension pneumothorax. Air was trapped in the chest cavity, crushing the soldier's lungs and physically shifting his heart out of place. Intubating him would only force more air into the chest, acting like a pressurized bomb. It would kill him in seconds. "Pressure is dropping. 50/30. He's coding," Brenda shrieked, stepping away from the table as the monitor unleashed a continuous, terrifying, high-pitched alarm. "Damn it," Sterling yelled, sheer panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. He dropped the bloody gauze, his hands shaking violently. "Start chest compressions. Get the crash cart." Compressions will rupture his heart, Thomas thought, his clinical detachment violently snapping. The timeline had run out. The soldier had maybe 15 seconds left before irreversible brain death. Dr. Sterling stood frozen, staring at the flat-lining monitor, his textbook civilian procedures utterly failing him in the face of brutal, unforgiving combat trauma. He didn't know what to do. Thomas Vance took a slow, deep breath. The quiet, submissive nurse died in that exhale. He stepped out of the shadows.
Thomas Vance didn't walk, he glided. Years of moving silently through hostile, pitch-black environments had ingrained a terrifying, predatory grace into his muscle memory. In 2 strides, he crossed the chaotic trauma bay, his hand snapping out to snatch a 14-gauge angiocatheter from the exact secondary cart he had meticulously prepped that morning. "Vance, are you insane?" Dr. Julian Sterling shrieked, his manicured hands hovering uselessly over the dying soldier. "I gave you a direct order to stay in the corner. Get out of my way before I have you arrested for medical malpractice." Thomas didn't even look at him. "Cancel the intubation," he ordered. The voice that came out of the graying, unassuming nurse wasn't his usual deferential murmur. It was a cold, concussive baritone, a voice built to cut through the deafening roar of artillery fire and command immediate, unquestioning obedience. The tactical shift in the room was palpable. Sterling's face twisted in absolute fury. He lunged forward to grab Thomas's shoulder. "Security! Get this lunatic out of my—" Thomas didn't strike the surgeon. He simply shifted his weight, dropped his shoulder, and deflected Sterling's grab with the immovable force of a concrete pillar. The hotshot doctor stumbled backward, crashing heavily into a stainless steel instrument tray and sending surgical tools clattering violently to the linoleum floor. The 4 special operations soldiers instantly tensed, their hands dropping defensively to their holstered sidearms. But the lead operator held up a clenched fist, freezing his men in place. His eyes were locked onto Thomas. He recognized the chilling, absolute absence of panic in the older man's posture. It was the look of a man who belonged in the carnage. "He has a massive tension pneumothorax," Thomas stated, his hands moving with blinding, mechanical precision. Blunt force trauma from the blast wave collapsed the right lung. Air is trapped in the pleural space, crushing his heart. Compressions will kill him. Intubation will detonate his chest cavity. Without waiting for permission, Thomas ripped the remainder of the soldier's charred uniform open. He didn't hesitate to search for the landmark. His fingers intuitively found the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line on the right side of the soldier's battered chest. "Hold him down," Thomas barked at the lead operator. The soldier immediately complied, pinning his commander's uninjured arm to the table. Thomas drove the 14-gauge needle directly into the chest wall. A sharp, distinct hiss sliced through the chaotic noise of the trauma bay, the unmistakable sound of high-pressure, trapped air violently escaping the chest cavity. Almost instantly, the terrifying, high-pitched wail of the flatlining heart monitor broke. The erratic line on the screen spiked, caught a frantic rhythm, and began to steadily march across the display. "Heart rate dropping to 110, an intern whispered, her voice trembling, eyes wide with utter shock. Blood pressure is rebounding. 90/60 and climbing. He has a pulse again." "Don't just stare at the screen. Triage isn't over. Give me 4 rolls of hemostatic combat gauze and a tourniquet," Thomas ordered, never breaking his lethal focus. "Now."
The intern scrambled to obey, bypassing Brenda, who was staring at Thomas as if he had just sprouted wings. Thomas took the supplies, turning his attention to the mangled shoulder. Sterling had been hopelessly dabbing at the surface bleed, blind to the underlying anatomy. Thomas drove his fingers deep into the wound, finding the severed artery by pure tactile instinct amidst the slip, hot rush of blood, and clamped down with brutal, agonizing pressure. He packed the combat gauze directly into the wound cavity with rapid, forceful thrusts, then wrapped the tourniquet high and tight around the axillary region to stem the retrograde blood flow. The massive hemorrhage slowed to a sluggish weep within seconds. "Stabilized," Thomas muttered, his hands coated in crimson, his breathing perfectly steady. He grabbed a sterile chest seal from the cart, slapping it over a secondary shrapnel wound to prevent further air entry. "Who the hell are you?" the lead operator breathed, his tough, battle-hardened exterior cracking to reveal genuine awe. He had just watched a civilian nurse perform textbook battlefield trauma care faster than a seasoned combat medic. Before Thomas could answer, the double doors to the trauma bay violently flew open. Two massive hospital security guards rushed in, their hands resting on their batons, followed closely by the hospital's imposing chief of surgery. Dr. Sterling, recovering his footing and his bruised, bloated ego, pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger directly at Thomas's chest. "Arrest him!" Sterling screamed, his face purple with humiliation and rage. "That rogue nurse just assaulted an attending physician and hijacked my trauma bay. I want him restrained and removed from this hospital right now."
The heavy rubber soles of the hospital security guards squeaked against the blood-slicked linoleum as they lunged into Trauma Bay 1. Behind them, Dr. Eris Thorne, the hospital's notoriously strict chief of surgery, surveyed the chaos with eyes like chipped ice. "What in God's name is happening in my emergency department?" Dr. Thorne barked, his voice echoing off the stainless steel cabinets. "That psychopath assaulted me!" Dr. Julian Sterling screamed, his voice cracking violently. He pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger at Thomas. "He pushed me away from a critical patient, performed an unauthorized, unsterile, invasive procedure, and hijacked my trauma team. I want him in handcuffs, Thorne, now." The two massive security guards moved in, reaching for Thomas's shoulders. "Touch him, and I break both your arms." The warning didn't come from Thomas, it came from the lead special operations soldier. In a blur of motion, the four battle-hardened operators shifted their stances, forming an impenetrable tactical wall between the hospital security team and the trauma bed. Their hands weren't on their weapons, but their postures radiated a terrifying coiled violence that froze the guards dead in their tracks. "Stand down," the lead operator growled at the guards, his eyes burning with lethal intent. "The only person in this room who knows what the hell they are doing is currently saving my commander's life. Anyone who interrupts him answers to me." Dr. Thorne's face flushed with indignation. "This is a civilian hospital, soldier. You have no jurisdiction here. That man is a junior nurse, not a licensed trauma surgeon. He has no authority to operate." Behind the wall of muscle, Thomas Vance didn't even flinch. He hadn't stopped moving. He kept his left hand clamped fiercely over the packed artery, while his right hand adjusted the IV flow rate with practiced mechanical efficiency. He completely ignored the shouting match happening just inches from his back. "Intern," Thomas said, his cold, commanding baritone cutting effortlessly through the screaming. "His systolic is hovering at 90. Hang a second bag of O negative and push 1 gram of TXA. We need to prevent the clot from breaking down." The intern, trembling but mesmerized by Thomas's absolute control, scrambled to obey. "Yes, sir. Pushing TXA now." "Vance, step away from that table immediately," Thorne ordered, stepping forward, desperately trying to project authority. "You are fired. As of this exact second, you are terminated, and I will personally see to it that your medical license is permanently revoked. Security, remove him." Thomas finally looked up. He didn't look at the guards, and he didn't look at Thorne. He locked eyes with the hysterical Dr. Sterling. The sheer freezing intensity in Thomas's gaze made the hotshot surgeon actually take a physical step backward. "You were going to intubate a patient with a massive tension pneumothorax," Thomas said. He didn't yell. He didn't have to.
His voice carried the crushing weight of absolute certainty. The positive pressure ventilation would have ruptured his remaining lung tissue and caused immediate cardiovascular collapse. You were 10 seconds away from executing him on this table because you were too panicked to recognize the signs of blunt force blast trauma. He was bleeding out, Sterling finally sputtered, grasping at straws to defend his shattered ego. I was controlling the hemorrhage. You were blindly dabbing at a peripheral capillary bleed while ignoring a severed axillary artery. You don't know how to treat a warfighter doctor. You only know how to treat textbooks. Thorne stepped up to the operators, his face turning purple with rage. I don't care what he did. I am the chief of surgery, and I will not have my staff humiliated by a rogue nurse. If you do not let my guards remove him, I will call the police and have you all arrested for trespassing and assault. The tension in the room snapped to a breaking point. The hospital guards unclipped their batons. The operators subtly shifted their weight, preparing for a brutal physical brawl right inside the trauma bay. The monitors beeped steadily, the only calm sound in a room ready to explode into violence. But as Thorne reached into his pocket to dial 911, the heavy double doors of the ER didn't just open, they were shoved apart with enough force to crack the drywall. A new figure stepped into the harsh fluorescent light, bringing a sudden suffocating silence to the room. He wore a crisp, dark suit that hid a heavily muscled frame, and a coiled earpiece rested discreetly behind his ear. But it was the 3 men flanking him that made Dr. Thorne drop his phone in sheer, unadulterated shock. They were fully armed, wearing black tactical gear devoid of any name tapes, bearing only a single highly classified crest on their shoulders. The suit scanned the chaotic room, ignoring the furious doctors, the nervous guards, and the defensive operators. His eyes locked dead on Thomas Vance, who was still holding the bloody combat gauze in place. "Stand down, doctors," the man in the suit commanded, his voice echoing with absolute federal authority. "Nobody is arresting that man."
Dr. Eris Thorne stared at the men in black tactical gear, his authority completely evaporating. "I am the chief of surgery," he sputtered, though his voice lacked its previous thunder. "You cannot simply storm into a Level 1 trauma center." "Department of Defense, Special Operations Command," the man in the suit interrupted, his voice a flat, deadpan drone that brokered zero argument. He didn't even bother flashing a badge. "And I highly suggest you lower your voice, Doctor. You are currently interfering with a classified recovery operation." Dr. Julian Sterling sneered, safely hiding behind Thorne. "Recovery? That rogue nurse is butchering your man on my table." Thomas Vance didn't look up. The political posturing behind him was white noise. His entire universe was the ragged rhythm of the soldier's pulse beneath his blood-soaked fingertips. "He's hypovolemic," Thomas announced, his tone clipped and purely clinical. "We need to initiate a massive transfusion protocol. Push warmed whole blood, not just O-neg. Give me calcium gluconate to counteract the citrate toxicity from the transfusions." The intern didn't look at Sterling for permission. She scrambled to the reinforced medical fridge, grabbing the supplies exactly as Thomas ordered. Suddenly, the trauma bed rattled violently. The wounded commander, hovering in the agonizing twilight between unconsciousness and shock, violently convulsed. It wasn't a seizure, it was a pure, unadulterated combat reflex. His eyes snapped open, blind, dilated, and filled with the terror of the ambush. He thrashed, his massive frame swinging wildly, threatening to rip the IV lines in the chest seal straight out of his body. "Hold him!" Sterling shrieked, backing away so fast he hit the wall. The 4 operators surged forward, but Thomas was faster. Moving with a terrifying, predatory speed, Thomas threw his upper body across the soldier's chest, expertly pinning the man's uninjured arm against the mattress while protecting the stabilized wounds with his own body weight. "Get off me!" the commander choked out, thrashing with the insane strength of a dying man. "You are off the X. Stand down, soldier," Thomas roared. It wasn't a request, it was an absolute localized thunderclap of command.
Thomas leaned directly into the commander's ear. "Viper Actual, this is friendly. You are secure. Stand down." The use of the classified tactical brevity code immediately worked like a physical switch. The commander's thrashing ceased immediately. His wild eyes focused on Thomas's calm, unblinking gaze. He took a ragged, rattling breath, gave a faint, exhausted nod, and slipped back into unconsciousness. Thomas exhaled slowly, carefully stepping back from the bed. During the violent struggle, the collar of Thomas's faded blue scrub top had been ripped wide open, and his left sleeve was pushed high past his shoulder. The harsh fluorescent lights of the trauma bay illuminated his upper chest and bicep, exposing a tapestry of brutal, jagged shrapnel scars that no civilian should ever possess. But it wasn't the scars that made the lead operator draw his jaw. Inked directly over Thomas's heart, partially obscured by a terrifying burn scar, was a faded but unmistakable tattoo. It was a winged golden trident, pierced by a combat medical dagger, wrapped in a serpent, the highly classified, heavily guarded insignia of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Tier 1. Above it, printed in small block letters, was a call sign that was the stuff of absolute legend in the Black Ops community. AKA Actual. The lead operator stared at the ink, all the color draining from his face. He looked from the tattoo to the graying, quiet nurse who had been emptying trash cans just 10 minutes prior. "My God," the operator whispered, the sound barely escaping his lips. "It's you. You're him." On the monitors, the impossible happened. The erratic beeping settled into a steady, rhythmic chime. The blood pressure stabilized at 110/70. The oxygen saturation climbed to 96%. Against all catastrophic odds, the blunt force trauma, the severed artery, and the tension pneumothorax had been perfectly, flawlessly mitigated. Thomas Vance had just pulled a man back from the absolute brink of death in under 4 minutes, using little more than a needle, combat gauze, and sheer, unrelenting willpower. Sterling stared at the monitors, his arrogant mind utterly incapable of processing the medical miracle he had just witnessed. He got lucky, Sterling stammered, his voice trembling with a pathetic mix of denial and jealousy. It was a fluke. He still violated protocol. The man in the suit finally moved. He walked slowly past Dr. Thorne, past the dumbfounded hospital security guards, and past the hyperventilating Dr. Sterling, not giving any of the arrogant civilian doctors so much as a second glance. He stopped directly in front of Thomas Vance. The man in the suit stopped just inches from Thomas. The sterile, fluorescent light of the trauma bay caught the silver lapel pin on his dark jacket, the crest of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The chaotic symphony of the emergency room had faded entirely, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed against the eardrums of every civilian in the room. Dr. Julian Sterling stood trembling near the shattered instrument tray, his perfectly styled hair now matted with sweat. Dr. Aris Thorne, the supposedly terrifying chief of surgery, looked pale and shrunken. They waited eagerly for the federal agent to handcuff the rogue junior nurse. They waited for their bruised egos to be vindicated. Instead, the man in the suit straightened his posture, his heels clicking together with a sharp, disciplined snap. He looked at the faded, winged trident tattooed over Thomas's heart, and then met the calm, unfathomable gaze of the middle-aged nurse. "Master Chief," the agent said, his voice echoing with profound, unmistakable reverence. The 4 heavily armed special operations soldiers, the same men who had nearly broken the hospital security team in half just moments before, instantly mirrored the agent. Without a single word of command, they shifted into perfect, rigid alignment. In absolute unison, the hardened killers raised their right hands in a crisp, flawless salute. "It is a profound honor, Master Chief Vance," the lead operator said, his voice trembling not with adrenaline, but with pure awe. "Command told us you were a ghost. We didn't know Archangel Actual was still holding the line." Dr. Sterling's jaw dropped so far it practically unhinged. The arrogant trauma surgeon looked frantically between the saluting soldiers, the federal agent, and the quiet man who had spent the last 6 months silently emptying his biohazard bins. "Master, Chief?" Dr. Thorne stammered, his authority completely evaporating into thin air. He pointed a shaking finger at Thomas. "He is a junior nurse. He transferred here from a rural clinic. He restocks our supply closets." The federal agent turned his head slowly, fixing Dr. Thorne with a look of absolute withering disgust. "The man you just threatened to have arrested," the agent said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register, "is Master Chief Petty Officer Thomas Vance, former Tier 1 Special Operations Combat Medic. He holds 2 Silver Stars, a Navy Cross, and has completed over 14 classified deployments in the most hostile environments on Earth. The field trauma protocols your hospital proudly hangs on its walls, he didn't just study them, Doctor, he wrote them." A collective stunned gasp rippled through the interns and nurses. Brenda, the cruel head nurse who had relentlessly mocked Thomas's age and speed, covered her mouth with both hands, her face draining of all color. She looked like she was about to faint. Sterling, however, couldn't let it go. His colossal ego, though fatally wounded, thrashed in blind denial. "That's impossible!" Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "He's a nobody. He doesn't have a medical degree. I am a board-certified trauma surgeon, and he hijacked my bay." Thomas finally moved. He slowly reached down and stripped off his blood-soaked latex gloves, tossing them onto the metal tray with a wet, dismissive slap. He walked slowly toward Sterling. For the first time since he had arrived at Seattle General, he didn't lower his eyes. He didn't shrink his posture. He stood at his full height, radiating the terrifying, gravitational pull of a man who had conquered death 1,000 times over. Sterling physically backed away, shrinking against the wall as Thomas approached. "You are a mechanic, Dr. Sterling," Thomas said softly, the cold steel in his voice slicing right through the surgeon's soul. "You know how to fix a machine when it's sitting safely in a bright, clean garage with all the right tools and a textbook in your hand. But out there, in the dark, when the machine is actively being destroyed and you don't have the luxury of a sterile environment?" Thomas leaned in, his eyes locked dead onto Sterling's terrified face. "Out there, you're not a doctor. You're just a liability." Sterling opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was utterly broken. He slumped against the wall, completely speechless and humiliated in front of his entire staff. The wounded military commander on the table let out a low groan. His eyes fluttered open, clearer this time. He looked past the monitors, past the interns, and found Thomas. The massive, battered soldier didn't salute. He didn't have the strength. Instead, he simply extended a trembling, blood-stained hand. Thomas stepped back to the bed and took the commander's hand in a firm, reassuring grip. "Thank you, Archangel," the commander whispered hoarsely. I knew you wouldn't let me fall." "You're secure, Viper," Thomas replied, his voice softening back into the quiet, humble tone he had maintained for months. "Your boys are taking you home." The federal agents signaled the operators, who immediately moved in to safely transport their stabilized commander. The agent looked back at Thomas. "We have a medevac waiting, Master Chief. A chopper is ready to take you back to command. They want you back in the fold." Thomas looked around the ruined trauma bay. He looked at the shattered egos of the elitist doctors, the awestruck faces of the young interns, and then down at his faded blue scrubs. He reached up, his fingers brushing the edge of the scar on his neck. "Negative, Agent," Thomas said calmly, picking up a fresh rag and turning back toward his supply cart. "I'd appreciate the offer, but my shift doesn't end until 0700, and someone needs to clean up Dr. Sterling's mess." The military team smiled,
saluted a last time, and wheeled their commander out of the double doors, leaving the arrogant, elitist staff of Seattle General standing in absolute stunned silence as the quiet nurse went back to work.